Good.
Yeah, we did.
Hi, Toufic.
Hi, I am.
Can you tell us what your name is and what you do?
Okay.
He's like written lots, so I have no idea what he's going to say. I give him a very loose plan.
Yeah.
But yeah, hopefully feel free to throw it out back to us as well.
Okay.
Okay.
Cool.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, everybody in the Hillside Collective, and thank you to Yoga4Palestine for organizing this event. My name is Toufic Haddad. I'm a Palestinian American academic right now who's at the University of Edinburgh doing a writing fellowship at one of its institutes called the Institute of Advanced Studies for the Humanities. I wanted to start this talk basically by thanking firstly the organizers for creating spaces like this and to be able to talk about yoga and Palestine. To large parts of my life, but in theory are not necessarily self-evident of how they would be connected and what they're all about necessarily. Certainly to people who are not insiders or know more about it. So hopefully this talk will be a way for me to shed light on my story and my work and what that connection is. So it's probably most appropriate to start by from this moment where we are here today. You know, sort of it's February 1st, but this is sort of 2 years after the world just witnessed a very horrific genocide that just took place in Gaza, where 71,000 people were killed. We have to remember that most of the population of the Gaza Strip, 80% of them are refugees living in 8 major refugee camps. 20,000 children were killed. The genocide was practiced in an effort to try and induce ethnic cleansing. Starvation was used as a method of war. There was also active use of targeting journalists, medics, hospitals, schools, as well as systematic rape of prisoners that took place. So certainly what we witnessed was a very horrific and traumatic series of events that should give us all pause to their import at this moment of time in history on a collective as well as an individual level. Of course, the genocide itself was not just perpetrated solely by Israel, actually. It was something that was much larger, actually. There was significant international contribution to make it possible, which also included the participation of the United Kingdom, this country. We also witnessed the significant paralysis and the disdain for international law and order, sort of significant forms of gaslighting by the established order. And we also saw significant repression on the home front against people who were trying to stop this, which had important implications on our democracy, our civil rights, our human rights, etc., let alone, obviously, what was happening over there. Moreover, on top of that, the Gaza genocide also gave us a window into, it kind of gave a sense of accelerating and giving a window and a harbinger for the potential horrors of future warfare, if what happened in Gaza would be able to be generalized further. It certainly brought back some of the horrors what we thought might have been over, but actually we realized they're not over. And actually, if these are generalized into broader context, it could be terribly more destructive for many more people. So all of this should give us pause for us to attempt to understand where we are in history and to sort of attempt to conduct a kind of soul searching for what this all means. Now, what does this have to do with yoga? I don't have a, a big answer, and there's not necessarily one single answer to that. What I think, what I'm going to try and do is begin to explain through my story how those things might come together. But with that said, before going there, as yogis, I think even though yoga is a broad school, we can all acknowledge that one thing that yoga does is it's an attempt to tie, to yoke, to unite, to bring together a material being with a spiritual, with an emotional, with an intelligence, right? A plan, something theoretical, right? And that's what differentiates it from exercise or gymnastics or whatnot, right? It's that consciousness of being embodied materially and theoretically at the same time through the body and uniting those together, as far as I know. So I will attempt to show how that comes together a little bit through my life story. So a little bit about myself. I said my name is Toufic Haddad. I was born to a Palestinian father who was from West Jerusalem, who was a refugee, and my mom is American, from Anglo-Scottish background. She's a wasp. And I was born and raised in Kuwait. Okay. I was not raised in a particularly politically conscious household. It was a middle-class existence. My father was an engineer. My mother was a house caretaker. And I didn't really question life too much in that existence in Kuwait in the 80s, which is a very diverse, sort of largely global South environment where I grew up in, until, of course, 1990, when there was a major war that took place. It wasn't even a war. The Iraqis invaded Kuwait, and we were on summer vacation outside. We were unable to return. So all of a sudden, our lives, I was 14 at the time, were turned upside down. We had a suitcase, everybody, bathing suits and summer gear, but nothing else. And within a month, we were sort of sent off to school and abruptly thrown into sort of American life in 1990, which was an awkward time in American history. In any case, yeah, but this profoundly destabilizing and sort of abrupt turn of events led to a kind of questioning inside myself, an instability around how I looked about the world. Initially, I had wanted to be an engineer like my father and sort of take over this in a sort of uncritical fashion. But this didn't seem to have much meaning in a context where I had seen my father work so hard his whole life to provide for us as 5 children. And at the same time, in a day and a night, we could be wiped out. And that's what happened to us, basically. We were homeless, our savings were away, we lost all our possessions, and we were living off of, with our grandparents for 3 years. So, and then we were sent off to boarding school in this sort of environment of like a war, and where people didn't really understand what was going on. Eventually, this questioning and this alienation that I was undergoing left me to leave engineering path to study philosophy, which took me to politics, which took me to the question of the Middle East, attempting to understand historically some of the events that were influencing my life. And eventually, it took me to Palestine. I was the first person in my family to be able to return there as an American citizen because I had no other citizenship. My father was unable to return as a refugee. And I returned in 1997 to Palestine as an American citizen, where I undertook work. And living and working in Palestine, that was obviously a very profound experience for me, because when I started working in a university there in Bethlehem, I met some folks there who were from a refugee camp. They invited me to come and live with their families. I lived there for 2 years. Eventually, I became more and more deeply involved politically and consciously and socially with the environment there. I became a journalist, and I began writing about what I was seeing there. And throughout the course from 1997 all the way to this day, which is basically my adult life, I became some form of writer or researcher or analyst or commentator on the situation in Palestine. So this path was the attempt to try and narrate and explain what happens in Palestine. It's obviously complicated, but it's a political act. It's an act of analysis. It's linked to history and theory. But what was happening in Israel-Palestine was not just something between Israelis and Palestinians, nor was it something between just Jews and Arabs or Muslims and Jews or those sort of superficial approaches to the conflict. So, very clearly, at least for me, it was about the deeper answer was sort of linked to colonialism, to imperial history, to the question of nationalism, its rise, how it dealt with its minorities, including Jews. It was also linked more profoundly to the question of capitalism itself, and what people can do to one another and what classes can do to one another in history. And in that context, Palestine was one frontier of that pronounced these contradictions of the system, but was not the only one where such forms of injustice could take place. And there were also forms of injustice that took place within the metropoles. And also, we could also acknowledge the humanity of even the perpetrators, and not just the victims, okay? So, and that fluidity that can take place without also bending the rules too much to ignore structural violence and structural injustice. And that became the framework of how I began to understand Palestine. So to do this and to develop this analysis required a kind of nuance and perception and detail, attention to detail, not flattening things, but having detail. I, of course, politically identify with this struggle, and personally, morally, intellectually, obviously, because it affected my life. Now, yoga begins to enter my life around the end of the Second Intifada. The Second Intifada is from 2000 to 2004, which is a major political uprising that takes place in Palestine, which I am in Palestine at the time. It entailed the Israelis reinvading the cities, being under curfew for long times, raiding our houses and stuff like that. Like, I mean, it all happened. It all happened, and I was a witness to it. But this profound experience of going through this period obviously had, was difficult personally, and I also struggled to, find coping mechanisms to manage the situation. And yoga became one of those. Truth be told, initially I was disparaging of yoga. I found it to be a kind of pseudo-spiritual practice, bourgeois in its origins, and I actually approached yoga as something that was a kind of exercise that could be cool, but in the end, whatever. But as I had the opportunity to do it, the psychophysical, somatic properties of it began to feel and experience that, which were very strong, and my body responded to them well. Ashtanga, in particular, gave me a disciplined and autonomous method that I could own myself without going to a class per se, and that I could investigate. And I like this idea of the research aspect of Ashtanga. So slowly but surely, yoga and its magic began to infuse my life, and the magic of its unifying properties of what it meant. So what was yoga doing to me? It was cultivating interiority. What does it do to all of us? It cultivates our interiority. It cultivates our focus. It allows us to distance stress, or understand how stress works, that we can tolerate it, but we can actually also overcome it, and also to differentiate between that which can be changed and which cannot be changed. And that which can be changed, we work methodically without stress, and what must be changed, that's what can be changed. And what can't be changed, we accept. We accept. And that differentiation is key in life for so many things. It gives us clarity, it gives us awareness, it gives us nuance, it gives us compassion for ourselves and for others. And all these, and also perhaps most importantly, it gives us an awareness of patterning. The patterns that we have developed somatically, emotionally, and physiologically as a function of our history and our life paths, okay? And to begin to identify that the normal of our lives, of how we used our lives, how we used our bodies, was actually not normal. It was conditioned. There was some forms of invisible structure and decisions that informed why we were like this and not like this, or the forms of trauma that life imprinted itself on our bodies, physically and emotionally and mentally. And yoga gave us tools to unravel, to open that up. And when that practice began to be reflexively practiced upon myself, it led to my own process of understanding, attempting to resolve some of the difficulties and complications of being a binational Palestinian American who was trying to find his place in the world, trying to find his personal purpose in life, etc. And so all of this had important complementarities and parallels also to the patterning. The patterning on the individual level also had important, I would say, parallels to patterning of broader systematic things as well. That my condition, the conditions that we had, that kind of patterning that takes place and is actually takes place in everyone, and it's actually socially conditioned and even on much larger levels, and has to do with how capitalism, I would argue, organizes life, how we must sell our labor, how we feel alienated from our labor, how capitalism contributes to forms of injustice and the rise of racisms and sexisms and prejudices, which these are the invisible structural aspects of our life which lead to other forms of injury and trauma and dehumanization and alienation that are imprinted in our life. So yoga thus became a kind of tool and method of self-discovery. It became a strong, humanist, emancipatory project and approach that had both individual and collective aspects to it. It showed that how liberation of the self is also not just possible in and of itself, but also must be connected to a form of collective liberation. And this is part of the problem that I have with how yoga, in a privatized capitalist commercial sense, attempts to find liberation through individuality, when actually our liberation is actually collective. And we have to also work on that broader collective level. In that regard, yoga becomes a revolutionary practice, a practice to preserve one's humanity and to expand it and to defend it. And that is how it begins to complement Palestine, because Palestine, in and of itself, when we begin to understand it as one of the most pronounced forms of injustices of today's modern world, we can also take inspiration from how Palestine also is the source of inspiration for continuous struggle of trying to preserve humanity, trying to preserve that the strong should not eat the weak, that etc. That there should be law and order, that there should be justice for all, and that peace is something worth striving for. So that's how I kind of see yoga and Palestine coming together. Thank you. I'm blessed.
So good.
Blessed.
Maybe an offer. The timing is impeccable.
It worked? Good.
I don't know how you did that. Maybe an offer for any comments or shares or questions. We maybe have just 2 or 3 minutes. Toufic, you maybe don't know Amy very well. She teaches our online Meister program, and she's currently based in Cornwall, and has also been quite active in attending protests in London and doing her part down in the south also as well. So she's also been well engaged as well. But yeah, Amy, if you want to share.
Just a huge thank you. You know, I went to so many talks, but I think it's the first time that yoga was in the Palestine talk for me. So even at yoga events, actually. So that was so wonderful how you brought them together, and with that kind of anti-capitalist slant as well, which seems the heart of it all. Thank you for sharing. And that was incredible. You fit so much into 20 minutes. I have a lot to learn from you.
Yes. Where can we read your writing?
I can share it roughly. I mean, I'm not. I have different kinds of writing as a commentator, sort of in a journalistic opinion piece kind of fashion. But then I also have done deeper research, and I have a book on which is my PhD. I did a PhD in development studies. I'm a political economist, so which means I'm studying the relationship between politics and economics, which is where my structural analysis comes out. Okay, so to reveal my cards a little bit more, yeah.
With that background, how can we be kind of positive or optimistic about where we're studying economy and politics together? How can we not become disgruntled?
Because it's up to us.
Yeah.
Because we have will. Because we have agency. Because there are people who came before us, who sacrificed, who struggled, whose blood was valuable, who inspired us, who made it what it means to be human. And we are part of that continuity. And we must, on an individual and a collective level. And without that, life is not worth living. That's what gives meaning to life. So I don't have time for despair. On a human level, we must be compassionate, recognize that there are ebbs and flows to movements and times, and not everything is possible at every time. It's not a straight arrow, whatnot. But the practice of a revolutionary life, of a yogic life, of a life that tries to embrace humanity and not fall into cynicism and despair is important. We see the vices around us of all orders. Capitalism is all about distraction, about separation, about alienation, about yoga is about bringing it together. Palestine is about sort of symbolically bringing that together. Of course, there's a real question of Palestine, of the people of Palestine too, I mean, but at this stage, it's something, Palestine is still the issue because it symbolizes so much. You're talking about 80 years of sort of the Palestine cause somehow processing and digesting the illnesses and the malaises of Western capitalism in this region in such a profound way, and that's not something that just affects Palestinians. It affects, this country, perpetuated. So it means it's done in our name. So it means we get the gaslighting from the people on top who lie to us, who call people who destroy, weapons, machinery that kills kids and women and whatever, Palestinians, and they call them terrorists. It's the inversion of life. We need to re-invert it back to how it should be, and that's only going to take place through us in our organization. So yeah, and yoga gives us important tools to do that and to remain strong. It's not the only tool, but it's a very personal one. That because in the end we only live through our lives, through our bodies, and we're not, and we should do what we can, basically.
So good.
Bless. Thank you.
Should we finish with just a simple on?
Sure.
Just a nice way to start.
No.